Thank you, Senator Mackenzie. Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the signing of the National Competition Policy agreements between states, territories and the Commonwealth Government, a landmark agreement for our nation. Australia then was a very different place. Almost all phone calls were made through one publicly owned telephone company, which just 2 years earlier had been called Telecom. Electricity was delivered by what were, in effect, large government departments. Prices were high, costs were inefficient, and were recovered disproportionately by high prices on businesses that increased their cost of doing business. National competition policy was controversial. Opposition to it formed a large part of Pauline Hanson's platform, but it was also hugely beneficial to our country. It primarily benefited all Australians through a reduction in prices. Electricity and telecommunication prices fell by a fifth. Rail freight rates dropped by 8% for wheat and up to 42% for coal, and port charges fell by 50%. Milk prices dropped by 5%, and the reductions were the result of increased efficiency and productivity, not a marketing campaign by a large supermarket chain. Other prices did go up. Principally, water prices rose by 8%, but this followed decades of underpricing for water and led to more responsible decisions on water use. Australian cities are some of the most water efficient in the world now, thanks in part to these changes that this has delivered, and this has delivered obvious benefits to our environment. In effect, the changes allowed Australian businesses to do more with less. That let them employ more people, and unemployment fell to levels not seen since the 1970s. Productivity growth was the highest in 40 years, and the average Australian was $7,000 or better off thanks to this economic growth. The Productivity Commission estimated at the time that the changes increased Australia's GDP by 2.5%. One of my first jobs as a professional economist was to work on the Productivity Commission's 2005 review of national competition policy. Most of the above figures come from that report, but unfortunately our record in the last 10 years has wiped away many of the hard-fought gains we then made. Since then, electricity prices have more than doubled. There has been a re-regulation of our ports and coastal shipping laws, leading to the absurd situation that it costs more to send sugar from North Queensland to Melbourne than it costs to send sugar from Brazil to Melbourne. Nothing demonstrates the change in our political debate better than the debate on the carbon tax, where 20 years ago Treasury and our central economic agencies would have extolled the benefits of lower electricity prices and their importance for the wider economy. During the carbon tax debate, they argued that higher electricity prices did not matter all that much because businesses can just pass them on. In 10 years, I've gone away from working in the Productivity Commission to becoming a senator for Queensland and for the Nationals Party in this place. The people that I represent, small businesses and farmers in Queensland, can't just pass it on. Many get paid based on a world price, and that no one in New York or international markets are going to pay our cane growers more just because Australian governments routinely ignore their costs. We have gone from having an electricity market that is based on getting the cheapest electricity dispatched first to one that gets the most expensive electricity, by definition, dispatched first. 20 years ago, when we signed national competition policy agreements, we established a national electricity market. We established an auction process that every 5 minutes sets a price for electricity in this country. We set up that market because it would provide incentives to make sure that the cheapest electricity was bought first in that marketplace, because that would benefit those that are purchasing electricity. Electricity was no longer sold on a Stalinist or planned way. It was sold on the basis of who could provide the cheapest electricity. Today, we have things like renewable energy targets, which by definition dispatch the most expensive electricity first. The most expensive electricity is still renewable energy, and under the renewable energy target, electricity providers must meet a mandated amount of their electricity production from those sources, from more expensive sources. And that pushes up the price and the cost of production, which will ultimately flow through to businesses and households and make us less efficient, less productive, have a weaker investment climate and lead to fewer jobs. I recognise as well that at the time national competition policy came in, it was hard for the Nationals Party and people in rural and regional areas. Many of the adjustment costs fell on regional areas, but then those cheaper electricity and freight rates were also of enormous benefit to rural industries as well. What frustrates me now as a member and proud senator of the Nationals Party is that while the man in the Akubra hat is told that he must be more efficient and he does not deserve subsidies, the man in the hard hat benefits from union-controlled building sites that pay productivity allowances that don't promote productivity outcomes. Country people are told they must pay cost-reflective prices for services, while a worker in a city can hop on a bus or a train and pay a fare that often is lucky to recover a third of the running costs of a public transport network. At the core of national competition policy was the application of competition and price oversight to the government businesses involved in the hard infrastructure sectors of energy, water and telecommunications. 10 years ago, in 2005, the Productivity Commission recommended that some of NCP reforms should be adopted and that they should focus on applying the same principles to the so-called soft sectors of health and education and training. That has happened to some degree. We've introduced case mix funding in our health sector. We have reformed some aspects of our education sector. But to a large degree there has been no coordinated approach from all state and territory governments and nothing to replace the competition payments that encourage states and territories to comply with those agreements. In effect, after 20 years of experience, we had 10 years of formal agreements with financial incentives to comply. In the last 10 years, we've had an uncoordinated and a haphazard approach that has not delivered the same kind of clear, national and consistent benefits. And I would argue that it is now time to reconsider our approach to these areas of reform. I compliment the government for bringing forward a root and branch review of the Competition and Consumer Act that has recently reported, the Harper Review. It's considering those recommendations now. But that was only one small component of the national competition policy reforms. At the time, those reforms did make changes to the then Trade Practices Act as a result of the Hilmer Review, but they didn't. They didn't just stop there. They did help make sure that we provide services to Australian people at the cheapest and most cost-effective way. They did ensure that our regulations were well suited to the objectives that they were seeking to fit and did not unnecessarily restrain competition and reduce benefits to Australian consumers. I do think it's time that we need to rediscover that approach, that we do need to rediscover a national and consistent and broad-based approach to reform, because clearly that approach delivered great benefits to our community. That approach worked in terms of providing effective incentives for governments to implement what was at the time difficult and tough reforms, and that approach delivered enormous gains for the Australian people. Those gains are still there. We can still make many gains in these areas for Australian people if we were just to return productivity growth, if we were just to return it to the level, the historical level we've traditionally had, not the level we've had in the last 10 years, which has been quite stagnant. If we were to return it to the level we've had historically, we'd deliver in 10 years the average Australian $6,000 higher income, $6,000 a year higher income if we were only to hit those historical productivity targets. Now, the only way we can hit those targets is not by just setting a target. Setting a target doesn't always just work. I set a target to get below 95 kilos and I've never achieved that, but I keep setting the target year after year. What we need to do is do things to actually meet the target. That takes hard work, like running around the lake, which I don't do enough of, or in our case it will take hard work to make these difficult decisions, to look into our electricity sector and look at whether we've got the right incentives in place there for the cheapest electricity to be produced, to look into the efficiency of our ports, which have become more inefficient over the last few years, to look into our telecommunications sector as well and make sure that is acting as competitively as it should, particularly with the emergence of the National Broadband Network. I think the government is right and proper to focus our debate on jobs and growth. It is the most important thing facing our nation. As growth has slowed since the GFC, jobs growth has not been as strong as it has in the past. Recently, jobs growth has started to pick up again, but we're only going to be sustainable if we focus on the small details first to lead to better outcomes. You don't go into a football game concentrating on the scoreboard. You go in concentrating on what the little things you've got to do to get that result. And that's what we need to have as an approach here too. We don't want to focus on the economic growth we need. We need to focus on how we're going to get that economic growth, what reforms we're going to put in place, and how we're going to make for a more efficient and cost-effective economy.
Thank you, Senator